Here we go with English colonization part 3. We're now going to look at some what I call macro motivations, but come to think of it, before I do that, I wasn't quite through with mercantilism. I have to tell you how mercantilism fits in with colonies or supports the idea of colonies, okay? Um, you can have mercantilism without colonies, as the illustration about the French and the silk illustrated. But colonies are like making your country bigger and hence less dependent. It broadens your sources of raw materials. It makes your domestic market bigger. If you have surplus stuff, you can dump it off in your colonial population. So yeah, that works really well. Now, in the late 1500s, there were actually two different Englishmen, an uncle and a nephew, who had the same name. Oh, that helps out. Richard Hakluyt. I guess that's how you pronounce that. The name sort of sounds like their ancestors immigrated from Holland. Anyway, one or the other, doesn't matter to us which, collected all the reports he could find about the New World discoveries there. And one of the others, the other one, posted this sort of open letter to Queen Elizabeth where he laid out in plain terms a mercantilist case for England starting to follow up on its claim and establish settlements in the New World. Some say Richard Hakluyt invented the British Empire, but there wasn't anything you could do about that until after the turn of the century. Well, the English began colonizing in the early 1600s. But the question is kind of where we started out. What would motivate people to leave England and go to America? It's a risky thing, more risky than they knew. It's expensive, it's hazardous. Why would they do that? The truth is, if England in the year 1600 had been happy, well-adjusted, at peace with themselves, no big controversies, full employment across the economy, looks good, but they could not have populated colonies. They could not have done it. What was required was what a historian named Carl Bradenbaugh many years ago called, and this was the title of this big old brick of a book he wrote, Vexed and Troubled Englishmen. Vexed and troubled Englishmen. You got a lot of people who weren't satisfied with life in England. You have an economy that's beginning to transition from a feudal or medieval pattern to a modern pattern that's dispossessing a lot of farm workers. You've got an economy which across the board is chronically depressed. You've got inflation. Really, the big feeder of this were farm workers. And here's what I'm telling you here. England in the early 1600s and pretty much through the century had a very large number of what we might call economic refugees or potential economic refugees. These are people who are probably just like they're down and out. They have no future in the English economy, and they might take advantage of the chance to go start over in some other place, even if it was risky and hazardous. So what was going on in England? What follows is English history. I'm just telling you about it so you kind of have an idea. There was something, it wasn't organized or anything, it's just something observed in retrospect, the enclosure movement. The enclosure movement. Here's part of the transition. In a traditional European economy, you would have the lord of the manor who actually owns or holds the feudal system for somebody higher up an area. Maybe there's a village, some farmers, he owns the land, and they're like sharecroppers. They're tenants, they're serfs, and they pay him a share of the crop to live on the land. And he's supposed to provide them with protection and justice and that sort of thing. In the mid-14th century, when they had a real pandemic, you don't want to know what they look like, called the Black Death, thinned out the population. Okay, around a third of the population of Europe died in 3 years' time in the late 1340s. And if I didn't say 14th century, I meant to. That gave the agricultural laboring class far more clout. So there's a tendency to change the deal from share of the crop to a fixed payment in money. So far, so good. But then Spanish silver and Spanish gold set off inflation. Prices are rising. Nobody knows why. And these deals where the farmers and their descendants through many generations, that deal doesn't get renegotiated. The amount of money stays the same, but the value of it is drying up. So the manor lords, it's not enough. So since there's a demand for wool, enclosure happens when the manor lord writes off whatever debts his peasants owe him, shoo them away, burn their little village, and enclose or fence in the land and start running sheep. Okay? You shear the sheep when the time comes, and you sell the sheep to people involved in the woolen cloth industry. That was England's niche economically. That's their whole card in international trade. And this is happening just a little here, a little there for something like 200 years. Where are these former peasants going to go? Not really a place for them. And this wasn't easy for the culture to understand. It was a culture with deeply embedded paradigms about everybody has a place, high, middle, or low. Everybody has a place and something to do. These guys don't have a place anymore. There's not cities where they can go get jobs or anything like that. We're still pre-industrial. So they're just left floating around, economically speaking. Some people who could not understand why it was that able-bodied looking people didn't have something to do someplace, called them sturdy beggars. But the preferred term here would be potential economic refugees. So when the American colonies began to open up, for most of the rest of the 1600s, it was not difficult to attract these people to America. The fact that about 70% of the people who went from Britain to America came from Britain to America during the whole colonial period came as came as indentured servants, contract laborers who accepted a boat ride to America in exchange for a labor contract where they would then work it off. That spells economic refugee. 2/3 of them. Okay, so this is a large category. Now, this does not mean they're genetically deficient. It doesn't mean they're stupid. It doesn't mean they're lazy or have low IQs. What it means is that they found themselves caught in an economy which had no place for them. However bad things might be in America, they couldn't be any worse. Couldn't be any worse than they were in England. And if you work hard and get lucky, the upside possibility is dazzling. So, potential economic refugees. There's another smaller, very different group, religious refugees. And these will also continue to be a population feeder throughout the colonial period. Okay, I'm about to have to describe a world which will seem very foreign to us. Okay, Europeans were very, very religious people, at least on the surface. 1 second, please. Excuse me. But in every European kingdom, there would be a church organization which was officially established. In much of Europe, it was the Roman Catholic Church. You weren't allowed to be anything else. And then from the early 1500s on, prior to colonization, there were various types of Protestant churches. Much of Germany was Lutheran. Scotland was Presbyterian. And the Dutch had what they called the Dutch Reformed. Most of them were influenced by the theological writings of a Frenchman named John Calvin. Anyway, England, and sparing the details, and I might even make a video about it sometime, England, the officially established church was the Church of England. Henry VIII set it up in the 1530s so that the Archbishop of Canterbury would grant him a divorce from his first wife, who was too old to have kids. He wanted a son, yada yada. You probably heard the story. At first, the idea was everything remains just like it was in the Catholic Church, except the Pope won't be the head of it. The king or the monarch, whoever it is, would be the head of it. So that's all you were allowed to be. Now there was a drift, strong drift in the Protestant direction through the rest of the century. but then in the late 1500s and into the 1600s, within the ranks of the Church of England, you have a movement of people who claim they're still loyal members of the Church of England, but they've been influenced by John Calvin. And they think the Church of England is too Catholic. They want to purify it, their term, from these Catholic influences. They were called Puritans. Okay, and they Elizabeth I could get along with them. She did not perceive them as a threat, but they're very strong in the English middle class. And when the Queen would summon the Parliament, the lower house is the one that has to do with taxation and stuff. It's the House of Commons. You're going to find a majority of those people happen to be Puritans. They're not a political party. They're not a political organization, but they see things a certain way. When Elizabeth died, her successor, James I, didn't like the Puritans, and they didn't like him either, but he didn't really mess with them or anything like that. When he died in 1625, his son became King Charles I, and Charles I lived in a kind of dream world, a royal absolutism. That means the king is the king. He's subject to no one. He's supreme. He can make up the law as he goes along and not take nothing off of nobody. And it offended him deeply that anyone in his kingdom would dare to have beliefs that contradicted his own. So during his time, times start to get rough for Puritans. Now, I'm going to put up a kind of almost an outline situation. Who is likely to become an economic refugee? The Puritans would lead the list just in numbers. It's in the six figures that fled England to escape religious persecution, which in fact, since we know how it turned out, never really materialized. So you have the Puritans. More about them when we start setting up the colony of Massachusetts. For the time being, let's say they're scared of the king and they want out. They didn't all come to America, but many of them did. The recording quit a minute ago. I only have about 2 minutes left on that part of it, so we're going to take this on to to part 4, where I'll have time to finish up. So see you back in a minute.